welcome to Paper Mill Prologues. For the fourth show of our 85th season, we are thrilled to be welcoming to our stage the explosive new musical, Gun and Powder. Based on a family legend passed down through generations, Gun and Powder follows the dangerous path taken by two young Black sisters as they seek to find their place in a world that cannot see them for who they truly are. Searching for love, connection, and a sense of identity in the Jim Crow South, together the sisters find strength in each other as they resort to crime in the face of oppression. The goal of Prologues is to give our audience an extra layer of insight and context for our productions by exploring some of the themes, histories, and cultural relevance behind each show. What we provide is by no means exhaustive, and we encourage you to continue to explore any topics we raise here on your own. You can also reference our works cited list at the end of the video to dig even deeper. In this video, we'll be taking a closer look at what post-Civil War life afforded the people of the South, and what it denied, and what could have driven Mary and Martha Clark to become gun-wielding outlaws.
The story of Gun and Powder begins in 1893, but in order to understand how the Clark family legend came to be, let's go back 30 years to January 1st, 1863, when President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then, thenceforward and forever, free. And the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authority thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons, and will do no act or acts to repress such persons or any of them in any efforts they may make for their actual freedom. Despite this proclamation, emancipation could not be implemented where there was Confederate control, and the enslaved people of Texas, the westernmost Confederate state, would not attain their promised freedom for 2.5 more years. In April of 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant, ending the Civil War. News traveled slowly, and over 2 months later, on June 19, 1865, Union troops arrived in Galveston Bay, Texas, a large percentage of those troops being Black soldiers, and they enforced the decree, liberating the 250,000 enslaved Texans. This day came to be known as Juneteenth, and it has long been celebrated by Black communities as a second Independence Day, or Freedom Day.
Well, can you remember how what happened when they set you free? Do you remember you remember how the old master acted when they...
No, so I can't remember that, But I remember, the time they give them a big dinner, on the 19th.
Is that right?
On the 19th, that's called, they said they give them a big dinner on the 19th. But now we didn't know. I'll tell you, I don't hide the other side of the folks, freedom. We didn't know. They just thought, we're just feeding us, and old master didn't tell it was free.
He didn't tell you that?
No, he didn't tell. They wait till, I think now they said they wait till 6 months out of that, 6 months, and turn them loose on the 19th of June. That's why, they celebrate that day, colored folks. Celebrate that day.
Freedom is a pillar of the American ethos, and in 2021, Juneteenth became a federal holiday, so all Americans can celebrate and recognize that there is no free country when its people are not free. After 246 years, the institution of slavery came to an end, but the future was unclear. Having existed with no agency and subsisting on no generational wealth, newly freed families had to figure out how best to move forward, and despite the promise of freedom, no law could remove the stain of the last 2.5 centuries, and racial prejudice was as strong as ever.
Though the order indicated the enslaved were free, if you look at the last sentence, it gives some instructions of what they can or cannot do.
The freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere.
When you're told you're free, you're thinking that, oh, I can live my life. But it wasn't like that.
On one hand, you were free by name, but the actual reality of freedom, you were not fully experiencing it.
There were a lot of very frightened former slaves, and a lot of them stayed on the plantation.
The period known as Reconstruction was both a time of great progress and great pain. The white South had lost much during the Civil War, and as black Southerners became more visible in society and politics, so too grew resentment and violence. With the establishment of the Freedmen's Bureau in 1865, the federal government aimed to provide newly freed slaves with the initial resources and assistance for a new beginning. While not a perfect system, the Bureau attempted to create a positive shift for black advancement by supplying necessities for African Americans such as food and clothing, building schoolhouses, legalizing marriages, and locating lost family members. Once dependent on the free labor of enslaved people, with the demise of slavery, the Southern economy was devastated. In 1865, President Andrew Johnson, a former slave owner, in opposition to the Freedmen's Bureau, ordered the pardoning of former Confederates and the return of land to former plantation owners, instead of honoring the commitment of redistributing the land to freed slaves. With little to no alternative options, black Southerners were forced into labor contracts with white landowners in arrangements that would develop into the system of sharecropping. Tallulah Clark, the matriarch of Gun and Powder, gained her freedom in Texas. Yet, like other families, the Clarks had little with which to build a new life. With a lack of resources and opportunity, Tallulah Clark became a sharecropper. Sharecropping was a form of tenant farming in which the landowner, usually a former slave owner, would allow laborers to rent small plots of land in exchange for a share of the crop or paid wages. The goal of workers in these arrangements was to climb the agricultural ladder and one day claim land ownership and economic independence for themselves. Along with the land being rented out, landowners or nearby merchants would also lease equipment, tools, seed, fertilizer, and housing to their laborers, which would be put on a line of credit and summed up at the end of harvest season. The Freedmen's Bureau would oversee and supervise these arrangements. However, the systems were engulfed in unethical and corrupt practices. Rigged weighing systems, as well as high interest rates, unpredictable harvests, drought, and infestations made the system nearly impossible to break free from. With all these factors against them, sharecroppers found themselves with debts that they could not repay to landowners. This created lasting conflicts throughout the Reconstruction era and the following decades.
It was the economic structure of sharecropping that allowed near-slavery conditions to continue on plantations.
Each year you borrow money, and at the end of the year often you can't pay it back because the price of cotton is falling and what you get for your crop is not enough to actually pay off your debts. So instead of getting out of debt, they're falling further and further into debt each year.
The only way for sharecroppers to pay back their debt was by providing another season of labor to the landowner. They were stuck in place.
What it meant was that African American laborers were tied down to certain geographical areas, and therefore they found it very hard to use their shares of the crop or other wages they might get to accumulate any resources and eventually purchase their own land.
Due to a lack of funding and support from Congress, the Freedmen's Bureau dissolved after only 7 years. This was also due to white fear of the presumed loss of power and control should these efforts toward racial equality persevere. Similar endeavors, including proposed reparations such as William T. Sherman's famous 40 acres and a mule policy, would also prove futile. Black Southerners had to navigate their advancement and liberation without this support. The sharecropping system continued, and while approximately 2/3 of all sharecroppers were poor whites and 1/3 were black, local laws and policies were set in place to further halt black advancement for the next 100 years. These included The introduction of the Black Codes, which forced Black people to sign labor contracts, such as sharecropping, or be jailed for vagrancy. The rise of convict leasing, which perpetuated slavery under a new name, allowing for Black prisoners to be sold to private enterprises as cheap labor by local prisons, face severe brutality, and be subjected to hazardous working conditions. And the Jim Crow laws, which were a collection of local statutes enforcing racial segregation and the disenfranchisement of Black people that would last until the civil rights movement of the 1960s. These laws were enacted by white-dominated state legislatures to remove political and economic gains made by African Americans during the Reconstruction era. White supremacist groups used extreme violence and terror in an effort to strip away their dignity and oppress further Black advancement. This immobilized Black Southerners seeking better opportunities and ultimately forced them into old systems of oppression in order to make ends meet and support their families. These cycles of economic stagnation meant that African Americans found themselves unable to relocate. The system of sharecropping would last in America until its decline during the Great Depression. However, its devastating effects on African Americans, economically, socially, and politically, continues to echo today. Despite all that they were facing, African Americans sought to live and prosper in the aftermath of slavery by voting, serving on juries, and holding office, even as their rights were constantly threatened at the local level and statewide. 52 African American men served Texas as either state legislative members or Constitutional Convention delegates during the last half of the 19th century. Some former slaves served in the Texas military in African American regiments. Native Americans gave these men the title of Buffalo Soldiers. Other African Americans became successful cowboys and horse wranglers on Texas ranches, among them Bob Lemons, who remains a legend to this day for his unique and highly effective technique for wrangling wild mustangs. He amassed both land and wealth and lived to be 99 years old and was a pillar of his community, aiding others through the Great Depression. Throughout the years of Reconstruction, African Americans continued to push for their rights as citizens, and despite being purposefully excluded from traditional avenues for social and economic advancement, they found ways to gain control over their own basic institutions. Many African American Texans moved from the state's rural areas to cities such as Dallas, Austin, Houston, and San Antonio. On the outskirts of these cities, they established freedmen's towns, self-sustaining communities built by emancipated slaves that provided support and safety away from white supervision. They were Black enclaves that provided protection from the direct effects of Jim Crow laws. Freedmen's towns prioritized the education of both adults and children with a strong focus on literacy. They built their own civic institutions and churches. At the start of their story, we find the Clarks working on the Billingsley plantation, surrounded by danger, disenfranchisement, and oppression. While gun and powder is American history wrapped up in family lore, the gun itself was a very real constant for the women of the Clark family.
It was a tradition, like a time-honored tradition for all of the Clark women in the family to carry their own gun. This was something that I wasn't fully aware of as a child, but the older that I became and the more I talked to more relatives and family members, I realized that all of my grandmother and all of her sisters who were in the same age range, grandmother-like figures to me, they all were packing heat. And they were very small. We're talking about derringers, like the size of the palm of your hand. But it wasn't about the glorification of guns. It was a symbol of power, of taking power into their own hands and taking their own protection and safety into their own hands. And also a sense of fearlessness, like whatever you are going to bring my way, I have an answer for it. That was old Betsy, essentially.
Their untenable way of life leads to the desperate choice for two Black women to attempt to walk in the world of white men, to take on the established ways of the world and turn them upside down. This is their refusal to be victims. It is their attempt to grab the advantages of a world denied to them. But to pass as white is a choice that could lead not only to physical danger, but to a loss of self. As Nella Larson writes in her Harlem Renaissance classic, Passing, she describes it as this hazardous business of passing, this breaking away from all that was familiar and friendly to take one's chance in another environment.
How it really relates on a universal level to the masks that we all wear in life. Sometimes we put on mask. It doesn't matter, whether your race or your religion or sexual orientation. There are so many instances in life where we will hide parts of ourselves and hide the truest parts of ourselves out of fear or shame, or because we need to feel comfortable in certain situations, or because we need to, please or placate other people or live up to some expectation that society puts on us. And something that we explore in Gun and Powder is the cost of that mask wearing, and how when you finally have the courage to take off that mask and embrace all of who you really are, that's when you can step into your power and live your most authentic life and honor your entire lineage and all of the things that make you you.
Like Passing, Gun and Powder provides a different understanding of Blackness, that it is not one shade, one experience, or any one way to exist. Gun and Powder provides an opportunity to see a story rarely told and to ask ourselves why it still resonates today. The legend of the Clark sisters centers on the ancestral knowledge that the wealth of the South was built on Black shoulders, and that there comes a time to take back what is owed. The story of Mary and Martha demonstrates just one way to take control, and as the century moved on, Texans took many avenues to claim and retain their rights. Unfair farming practices led to the creation of the Colored Farmers Alliance.
Frustrated and frightened, Black farmers began to organize in order to survive. Banned from many all-white farmers' alliances, they formed their own group called the Colored Farmers Alliance. In 1886, they established a national organization and a network of chapters spread across the South. By 1890, the Colored Farmers Alliance boasted 1.25 million members. The Colored Alliance was made up of early supporters of the Populist Party, but when Southerners began to attack populists for undermining white supremacy, members of the Colored Alliance were expelled from the party.
Women's social organizations were popular in Texas at this time, and both white and Black women joined and formed these organizations. Among them was Eliza E. Peterson, who would eventually be elected state president of the Colored Division of the Texas Women's Christian Temperance Union. Peterson was devoted to social reform and the betterment of her people. Peterson traveled throughout Texas, establishing local and youth Women's Christian Temperance Union groups in an effort to decrease alcohol consumption. She was described as having good sense, undaunted enthusiasm, and burning zeal. And among her audiences were Black and white listeners, male and female. Despite incredible opposition, several Black colleges had been founded in Texas prior to the turn of the century. Among those institutions were Texas College, Paul Quinn College, and Guadalupe College. These schools were known for their commitment to Black education, being some of the only institutions founded by Black Americans for Black Americans. Black religious organizations, such as the African Methodist Episcopal Church, were establishing institutions of higher learning, specifically for the advancement of Black Americans. They utilized Black personnel, administrators, and teachers, providing both education and employment opportunities to their communities. Historically Black colleges and universities, or HBCUs, some founded by Black religious organizations and some by white, have since contributed exponentially to the ongoing education of Black Americans. Black American history, like Blackness, comes in many shades. There are great legacies of education, protest, ministry. And one of the greatest legacies is that of its music. Gun and Powder features sounds of the past and sounds of the present. It takes inspiration from folk, gospel, soul, and traditional musical theater to join the past with the present.
So let us take a critical look at our past as we seek to understand our present. And let us celebrate how far we have come in the last century and a half as we embrace this bold, untold story that demands to stay hidden no more. Enjoy the show.